Joining me on the panel tonight from a busy day in Canberra, The Guardian Australia's political editor, Catherine Murphy. Thanks so much for making time for us, Kath.
No worries. Hi.
In Adelaide, former Howard Government Minister Amanda Vanstone. Are you fed up yet, Amanda Vanstone?
I'm here, Ellen.
In Melbourne, former political editor at The Monthly, Sean Kelly, who was Labor advisor to Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. I guess you've seen this movie before, Sean?
Depressingly so.
And also in Canberra, social researcher and author Hugh McKay. Thanks so much for joining us, Hugh.
Good evening, Ellen.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum and on Facebook. 48 to 35. That was Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's margin over his challenger Peter Dutton in today's Liberal Party leadership spill. With speculation of another spill building, only 7 members would need to change their vote. Here's the Prime Minister.
What I say is exactly what I said to them, that we need, to all of my colleagues, that we are united, we are able as a team to deliver the great results, continue to deliver the great results that we have for all Australians.
What do you say to the overarching sentiment now that you're just a dead man walking?
Well, I'm afraid to say that I can't agree with you there, and the results of the ballot today demonstrate it.
Julie Bishop, who was re-elected unopposed as Deputy Liberal leader, put a positive spin on the situation.
The fact is the result today was an overwhelming vote of support for the Prime Minister. I've seen leadership contests before. This was an overwhelming vote of support for the Prime Minister.
And for now, overwhelming support trumps considerable support.
Look, the first thing I want to do is say thank you very much to my colleagues for their considerable support in the party room, and I'm going to make sure that I can do all I can to make sure that the coalition wins the next election and that Bill Shorten never ever becomes Prime Minister.
Peter Dutton has resigned as Home Affairs Minister and moved to the backbench, although the Prime Minister did offer him the opportunity to stay in his role. Treasurer Scott Morrison is now acting Home Affairs Minister ahead of an impending reshuffle. Amanda Vanstone, let's get right down to it. You said earlier to me that you're fed up with this crap. What on earth is going on in the Liberal Party?
I don't know, Ellen, that I use that terminology, but it's
certainly not. I'm sure you would have.
But it's true. Well, I might have privately done it, but not to you today. But look, the facts are the vote today is higher than the vote Malcolm got when he won the leadership. And it would be higher again if Arthur Sitodinis was there today. So with a higher vote, I'm amazed to hear media people saying, well, the slimmest of margins. It's a better vote than he got last time. Now, what should that core vote be? Because everyone knows when Menzies set up the party, he said we have Conservatives and Liberals. Look, Kevin Andrews can stand as Deputy Leader and get 30 votes.
Right.
Kevin's in a safe seat. He'll never win a marginal seat. So, you know, I'm quite buoyed by this result today. It's better than when Malcolm took over the leadership. And part of the reason I'm buoyed is I think some people weren't expecting him to say, well, let's show the community at large that we're a unified party. There's been too many rumblings. Let's clear the air. I think with a bit of time, people who voted for Dutton will start to think, now let's consider the judgment of Conservatives here. They thought they were on a winner having a postal vote with same-sex marriage, a postal,
yes, plebiscite.
Yeah, plebiscite with same-sex marriage. In Abbott's seat, in Andrew's seat, in a whole range of seats around Australia, Australians said to these guys who are entitled to have more conservative views, but not entitled to try and insist that we all adopt them. The rest of Australia said, you know what, we don't agree. Votes of 60, 58, 64%. In what was seen to be quite conservative seats. So the judgment of these people needs to be called into mind, and marginal seat holders and anyone in the Senate who wants to be in government will over the next few days be reflecting on that same-sex marriage vote and saying, what's the judgment of these guys? How in touch with the electorate are they? They're in touch with themselves, sure, but not with the electorate at large, and I think people who want to be ministers or retain their seats in the lower house will get a grip on that in the next week or two.
Kath Murphy, does the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull have that time for reflection, as Amanda Vanstone suggested is required here?
I doubt it. I doubt it. On current indications, I doubt it. Amanda's quite right in terms of enumerating those the vote he got last time and the vote he got this time, but the circumstances are different. And The fact of the matter is whether or not you accept that Conservatives have got good judgment or whether they've got poor political judgment, the fact of the matter is, holus bolus, apart from a couple of critical senior players, the Conservative faction has picked up as one and moved away from Malcolm Turnbull. Now,
they were never with him.
Well, that's fine. That's fine and true, except for a period of time, Amanda. I think you'd agree that the bulk of the Conservative faction thought that they needed Malcolm Turnbull as a figurehead in order to win elections, and so that has sort of created a period of détente where Malcolm Turnbull has been tolerated as a figure by the Conservative faction as long as he's given them, pretty much every concession they've asked for. And that period of accommodation is now at an end. Now, what's changed it? What's changed it is the result in the Longman by-election, which has alarmed a number of people. And here we get to the nub of the issue. The Liberal Party going into the next election has a split constituency. It has a moderate Liberal progressive constituency, and it has a constituency which is either moved already or is at risk at moving in the direction of political disruptors like One Nation. Now, what's caused the elevation of Peter Dutton as an alternative leader within the government at this time is a judgment that Conservatives are making that they need a better figurehead in order to appeal to the vote which is at risk or has gone to One Nation. And this is the judgment they're making. Now, I agree with Amanda that this is, it doesn't solve the split constituency problem. Putting up Dutton may or may not appeal. There might be a better connection between a political figure like Peter Dutton and voters who are drifting off in the direction of One Nation. That's possible. But what you gain, you lose on the other side of the equation. So it's genuinely a vexed and difficult issue.
Okay.
And sorry, go on, Ellen.
Well, let's turn to Sean, because you had a front row seat to all of this in the Gillard-Rudd years. Now let's look at Mr Dutton. And Chris Kenny, writing in the Australian today, said that these sorts of leadership spills have the tedium and familiarity of a fire alarm, right? We all know. Put on the hard hat and go down the stairs, and we know which position to assume. Now, Dutton says he's returning to the backbench and he supports the Prime Minister today, but he won't rule out a future challenge. Does that mean, Sean, that Malcolm Turnbull is safe?
Look, absolutely not. People tell their story, and I actually don't know whether it's true, but there is certainly a truth within it. And it is that on the night of the first Keating challenge to Hawke, which Paul Keating lost, there were expected to be amazing celebrations in Bob Hawke's prime ministerial suite of offices. But in fact, the atmosphere in those offices was absolutely dead. It was non-existent. All of the celebrations, all of the champagne drinking, all of the dancing into the night was in Paul Keating's office. And that's for the very simple reason that despite what Amanda says, and I wish Amanda were right, I think Peter Dutton will be a disaster for this country. I'd rather see Malcolm Turnbull remain Prime Minister. But despite what Amanda said, it's not really about the margin at this point. It's about the fact of the challenge. Once a challenge has happened, it is very, very, very hard to recover from. It can happen. It happened when Andrew Peacock challenged Malcolm Fraser, but Malcolm Fraser had a lot more authority, had been Prime Minister for significantly longer than Malcolm Turnbull has been. And the other really significant thing which is happening now in a way that I don't think we've seen in a very long time is that you have a leadership challenge that is about a genuine philosophical dispute. I think we were always going to get here. I think the Conservatives were always going to reach this conclusion for the simple reason that from the start of Malcolm Turnbull's Prime Ministership, the Conservatives within the party knew that they could not afford the moderate Malcolm Turnbull Liberal Prime Ministerial experiment to succeed. If it had succeeded, then there would be an alternative model for Liberal Prime Ministers in this country as moderates.
So they're saying it is a fight for the heart of the party, you're saying? A fight for the heart of the party?
100%. It's been on from the start.
Right.
At the start, it was about tying Malcolm Turnbull's hands. At this point, having tied Malcolm Turnbull's hands, it's about getting rid of him altogether and proving that the experiment has failed. They might have caused the failure to a very large extent, but that won't affect their talking points.
Ellen, if I could just say something here about the notion of a fight for the heart of the party.
Yeah.
Look, I just think that's rubbish. You saw from the same-sex marriage vote where the heart of the Liberal Party is.
Is that the heart of the Liberal Party, Amanda Vanstone, or was that the heartbeat of the nation?
Well, the nation as a whole. But what I'm saying is it demonstrates to Conservatives that they are not the heart of the Liberal Party. They would like to be, but they are not.
But that doesn't mean there's not a battle. It just means the Conservatives are delusional.
Kath Murphy, just jump in.
What it means is that the battle is about, let's not kid ourselves here, this is a battle about people who want leadership positions.
Sure.
That's what this is about. It's not about philosophy or something. Dutton wants to save his seat. This is a guy who 2 or 3 days ago was saying to Cabinet colleagues and to the media and to Australia at large that he supported the Prime Minister. He got a chance today to show everyone that was true, and he demonstrated that it wasn't.
All right, Kath Murphy, just before we go to Hugh Mackay, is this a fight, an ideological fight for the soul of the Liberal Party, or is this about saving the furniture in Queensland where there are lots of marginal seats, including the seat of Dickson, which is held by Peter Dutton?
I think it's both.
Right.
Purely and simply, I think it's both.
100%.
I think there's a core group of a core group who have driven this insurgency on the basis that this is a holy crusade for the heart of the Liberal Party, and they don't mind whether the scores are settled in government or whether they're settled in opposition.
And just before we go to Hugh, explain this to me. Sky is reporting that several senior ministers, including frontbenchers Steve Chiobo, Michael Keenan and Greg Hunt, who reportedly desperately wants to be deputy to a Prime Minister Dutton, remain in the cabinet. Is that feasible? I mean, as far as I can see, only the junior minister Michael Sukkar has offered his resignation because he voted for Peter Dutton. Kath?
Oh, sorry. I thought that was for you, Ellen. I'm sorry about that.
Is that feasible that those people could stay in the cabinet?
Is this feasible and reasonable? Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty poor form myself. I think if you go through a leadership ballot and you're sitting in the cabinet and the ministry and you don't vote for the leader, then I think you need to question why you're still in the cabinet and the ministry. Whether or not these guys will or not, it remains moot. Also, I think one of the tactical advantages that the Dutton camp have at this point is this sense of stringing out a crisis. So there are a number of protagonists here who can choose the timing of their resignations if they so choose. I think we've seen this in the past. So I'm just saying maybe there's a tactical element to people sitting tight. Maybe there's a practical element. One moderate minister said to me today, do these guys want to drop 200K? Ha ha. But I think it's watch this space. Yeah, Sukkar's move is interesting and may contribute to a drip feed of others, which creates this cascade, this sense of crisis and instability, and that's part of the theatre of leadership challenges.
Well, that's all true, of course, but equally, Catherine, I hope you agree with this. It does nothing for the credibility of those people, because as you say, if you are invited to support your leader or not, and you don't, and you then want to still sit at that leader's table, but a few weeks later you decide otherwise. Yeah. I mean, Aussies don't like a wrecker.
No, I totally agree. I hope I said, because I fluffed the transition from you to me. I think I said that this is very poor form, and it is.
You did.
It's not on.
Hugh Mackay, how do Aussies feel about wreckers?
Well, look, before I respond to that, I think the people we should feel sorriest for in all this are the paramedics. The paramedics used to have the question, who is the Prime Minister, as a very reliable test of people's cognitive function if they'd had a knock on the head. And for the last 10 years, that's become a less and less useful question. Look, how do Aussies feel about a wrecker? I think there's a bigger question. How do Aussies feel about this sort of political turmoil? How do they feel about leadership speculation? We so often hear politicians in particular saying, oh, as far as the community is concerned, they wish there'd be none of this speculation about the leadership and all of this tussle. Couldn't they just get on with running the country? Well, the truth is that politics is currently held in very low esteem in Australia, along with most other institutions, but politics in particular. Both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have extremely low levels of popularity. The government has been trailing the opposition for 38, is it, of the last news polls. And generally speaking, and most media people will tell you this, when you start talking about politics, people tune out. People go to considerable lengths to avoid engagement with political debate at a time when they have such low esteem and so little trust in the current crop of political leaders in particular. So when there's a Barnaby Joyce scandal,
yes,
or when there's a leadership tussle, suddenly you'll notice there'll be a spike in the TV news ratings tonight, and newspapers will sell a few more copies tomorrow, because suddenly it's interesting. And I don't think all the niceties of how proper or improper it is for people to remain at the cabinet table when they've secretly voted, right, all of that stuff I think is lost. It's now just a blood sport. And politics really...
And are you suggesting that Australians are sitting at home tonight? What would be your sense, with a sense of, oh my gosh, not this again, or there, you know, there we go, there's the gladiators, draw blood, let's see it.
Yes. Oh, what they'll say, especially if a opinion researcher asks them, they'll say, oh, isn't this awful, not this again, oh dear, oh dear. But actually, as we know, the sort of things that sell magazines, the same sort of things that sell news ratings, they'll be rubbing their hands. What's going to happen? Is it going to be another challenge on Thursday, etc.? I mean, it's now sport again, and that makes it more interesting than it was. And by the way, I think the whole political theatre has itself to blame for the fact that we've got to this situation. I think one of the major problems in contemporary Australian politics is that the whole ethos, the whole strategy of consumer mass marketing, brand marketing, has been grafted on to politics. So it's become all about brand Turnbull, brand Shorten, brand Labor, brand Abbott, etc., which trivialises the whole thing, and means that things like news poll voting intention surveys become absolutely critical, as though they're a measure of the brand share this week. Once you've trivialised politics, then of course people are much more interested in the game than in the substance.
Kath Murphy, you have written for The Guardian that the Liberal Party were choosing between three strategies for the next election. One that you call Better Angels, which was stick with Turnbull, hope he can get his energy policy through and run on your record. Part Trump, which was a return to Tony Abbott. And Full Trump, which was going with Dutton, which you also referred to as Let It Rip. Are we in for Let It Rip, and what does Let It Rip look like?
Well, I think that is a discussion that the government is having with itself in full public view. This sort of goes to the heart of what this leadership tussle is about, despite, apart from the factors that we've already mentioned, right? Brutal power play, ideology. The government, right before our very eyes, is determining what face it's going to present to the voters at the next federal election and who is the best face for that strategy. Now, what does it look like? Full Trump? Well, we know what that looks like, don't we? We've seen it. So we know what it looks like.
But what's the Dutton version of that?
Well, basically, Peter Dutton, in his Sky News interview this afternoon, said he wasn't going to lay out a manifesto. Then he laid out a partial manifesto, which is that we need to have a conversation about immigration, one of the most sensible, or sensitive, I should say, sensitive political subjects in this country, and also a sort of more punter-friendly, cost of living type approach. Now, I think we know what that looks like. I think we know what that campaign looks like. I think we can sense what that campaign will be. Now, the question is, does that campaign work? Now, it obviously worked for Donald Trump in the US. It's worked in some parts of Europe where Trump-like figures have risen and prospered in the disrupted political environment post-global financial crisis. Does it work in Australia, where you've got compulsory voting and where economic conditions have not been the same here as elsewhere? Well, I guess we're going to find out.
Sean, you've written that the prospects of a Dutton Prime Ministership horrifies you and should send shivers through us all. But today he was saying that he wants us to know the real Peter Dutton, the Peter Dutton who can afford to smile more.
Smiley.
Smiley Peter Dutton. Are you still shivering, my friend?
Look, I am, and I think this is very important. I think as people move closer to serious power, closer to leadership, they are usually afforded a level of credulousness. People start to think, well, they've been a certain way in the past, but perhaps they'll grow up. And people thought this about Tony Abbott. They thought he'd grow into the job. But actually, as opposition leader, he was a great opposition leader, and as Prime Minister, he was a great opposition leader. People thought perhaps Donald Trump would be constrained by institutions and would realise the responsibilities of the job once he actually won the election. Donald Trump has clearly become more Donald Trumpish in that job.
So what does a more Peter Dutton look like, smiling or otherwise?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the central fact of Peter Dutton's political existence has been that he is willing to use race as a political tool, to use race as a tool with which to divide the nation. I think it is also important to realise, for Liberals considering voting Peter Dutton in as Prime Minister, that even if you happen to agree with Peter Dutton's policies, it should be realised that he's a very narrow character. He has never demonstrated policy ambition. He has never demonstrated significant competence. As Health Minister, he tried to introduce a Medicare co-payment. He failed. Doctors voted him the worst Health Minister in 35 years. As Immigration Minister, he failed to answer the most basic questions from journalists about his values test and the way it interacted with language skills, with police checks. 9 asylum seekers and refugees have died on his watch in offshore detention. And when asked about various issues around offshore detention, we know that there are horrific circumstances there. He has cautioned against compassion. He has dismissed allegations of abuse as hype. They are not hype. They are allegations which have been made by very serious international organisations. That is a type of strongman that the Liberal Party is currently considering installing as Prime Minister. And I would say there are Republicans, to carry on from Catherine's analogy, there are Republicans right now in America who for the rest of their lives are going to have to bear the ignominy of having put Trump in, of having passively stood by while he began to wreck their country. And the moderate Liberals who are preparing to vote for for Peter Dutton or to serve under Peter Dutton...
No, they're not.
Should think very carefully.
Amanda, I just want to play the audience just a little bit of a video here. Peter Dutton, as we say, has accepted the decision of the party room for now. He spoke to Sky News this afternoon with photos of his children behind him.
I lost the ballot today. I accept the outcome, and for me, I just want to be in a position now to support the government, make sure that we win.
And Twitter users have marked the former Home Affairs Minister's loss under the hashtag #PutOutYourPotatoes. Lots of pictures of potatoes being put out. I'll let you draw your own conclusions there. Amanda Vanstone, that has been the commentary today, that if Peter Dutton was to assume the Prime Ministership of the country and take the country to the next election, it would be a very divisive election. Do you share that fear?
I'd be apprehensive about that. I mean, what I would say to the Conservatives who've expressed the same view that they expressed when Kevin Andrews stood as Deputy Leader is, look, just think about this very carefully. You go back to the mighty Richmond Football Club, not as mighty as the Port Adelaide Football Club, but a mighty club who won after God knows how many decades out. And if you speak to Peggy O'Neill, the President, she says to the media, we play for each other. That's what a team's meant to do. And I would say to any Conservative who can't bear that, just think about your position. I mean, I think Abbott, for example, who said he wouldn't snipe and disagree from the side and has done nothing but that. It's up to him to decide what to do. But, gee, people say to me, why doesn't that guy leave?
How much damage do you think, or has he damaged Australian democracy, Tony Abbott, in his years in leadership roles? What do you think of what he has done with his leadership possibilities?
Well, look, he surprised me as opposition leader because he did show considerable discipline in that job, which I hadn't witnessed before when he worked as my parliamentary secretary, and I had not witnessed discipline when he was in the ministry at all. I think I've said before, Howard let him get away with hell that no other minister would get away with. So, I think he's been a wrecker. I think from the day he was born, it's all about him. Apparently his mum said to him he'd be Prime Minister or Pope, and of course he believes it.
Ellen, could I say something about the comments that Sean made about Peter Dutton? I agree absolutely with Sean's assessment of Peter Dutton, which raises, of course, the question, how come a person like Malcolm Turnbull is vulnerable to a potential challenge from a person like Peter Dutton. In other words, we can talk about this as just one of a series of leadership tussles, or we can look at some of the specifics of this particular tussle. And I think it's very important to consider why Mr Turnbull has become vulnerable. And I think one of the reasons put forward by various people who've commented on this is that this is a man who, since he was a schoolboy, was driven by the ambition to become Prime Minister. Now, I think that's a very dangerous kind of ambition. It means that once you've become Prime Minister, the ambition is achieved. It wasn't an ambition to convert us into a clean energy environment or to eradicate poverty or to make us a more equal society or to lift the standards of public education. It was the ambition to be Prime Minister. So once you're there, it's not surprising, if that's your ambition, it's not surprising that we would see the sort of concessions, backflips. The Republic, which was a great passion, has vanished. The NEG is another example of this. We think just around the corner is another capitulation on company tax cuts. None of this is surprising if you have already achieved your ambition. In other words, whatever happens can't take away from the fact that I have become Prime Minister. Now that means I think that a Prime Minister of that kind, driven by personal ambition for the office, is very vulnerable to people who want more policy substance, who want more conviction. It seems to me an appalling prospect that Peter Dutton is being considered as the alternative, but it's not at all surprising to me that an alternative would emerge when you have a Prime Minister behaving like this one.
All right, well, let's have a look at the Prime Minister. Yesterday, Malcolm Turnbull announced the end of the National Energy Guarantee, at least in the form that had been taken to the party room, and many saw this as a way to placate fractious elements in the party. And yet, here we are. Today, the Prime Minister survived a motion of no confidence from the Labor Party. But with the Prime Minister up against it, some are up asking, what happened to this guy? Catherine Murphy, what happened?
The Australia of the future has to be a nation that is agile, that is innovative, that is creative. We cannot be defensive, we cannot future-proof ourselves. We have to recognise that the disruption that we see driven by technology, the volatility and change, is our friend. Is our friend if we are agile and smart enough to take advantage of it.
Catherine Murphy, that was the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull back when he took over the Prime Ministership. I mean, what do you say happened to that guy, that conviction politician who believed in the Republic, who believed in very much action on climate change? I'm not interested in leading a political party that isn't serious about action on climate change. What happened to that guy?
What happened to that guy? Well, it's sort of been the deep mystery of this Prime Ministership. But I think it is more, with great respect to Hugh, I think it is more complicated than somebody just having an ambition for the office and no agenda. I think Michelle Grattan, in her characteristic cutting to the point way, once described Malcolm Turnbull as the venture capitalist politician. He sort of brings that mindset with him, which is unusual in politics, which is a tribal, clubbish sport. Malcolm Turnbull is an outsider to politics. He brings a highly pragmatic and rational approach. Where he gets into trouble is when he meets people who he thinks are not rational. He is sort of perpetually confused when he encounters something that's...
I'd like to go after Catherine.
Keep going, Catherine, then we'll go to Amanda Vanstone.
Well, it's just an interesting feature of Turnbull's personality. He defaults to uber rationality. Today, for example, in that no confidence motion in the Parliament, it was a procedural stunt that Labor pulled on, but nonetheless, this man is currently in the fight for his political life. His disposition in that set of circumstances was to give a PowerPoint presentation. This guy is not a natural politician. He doesn't have normal political instincts. He's an outsider, and he's sort of on this journey in politics, and we've learnt a lot about him as a consequence of him being on this journey. So I don't think it's all about ambition. There's no substance there. I don't think that's quite right. I think He needs perpetual motion, he needs perpetual stimulation, he moves from one thing to the next, he doesn't dig down and sort of burrow down, get into detail, sell, campaign. This guy does not campaign. He is the first Prime Minister that I have seen that doesn't conduct a national conversation and does not campaign. He is a highly unusual political figure, and I don't think we can reduce him to a caricature, frankly.
See, Amanda, you were one of the great communicators of the Howard government. I mean, put your hand on your heart. When you look at Malcolm Turnbull, is the problem, as Tony Abbott says, that he lacks real convictions for the things that he says he believes in, or, as Kath's suggesting, the problem is that he lacks the skills, the time in political life to know how to prosecute a national argument, how to win a debate?
I don't think it's either of those. I mean, with respect to Hugh, any Prime Minister that I've watched or been in Parliament when they've been there has always wanted that job. So let's not pretend that Malcolm's different than any other Prime Minister.
You don't get there without ambition.
And I'm prepared to say, unless you desperately want it from when you're about a teenager, you're not going to get it, because it's a very hard job to get.
And I'm not against ambition, and I'm not suggesting that that isn't true. It's a question of what the ambition is for.
Yes,
is the ambition to be Prime Minister, or is it to better society? The other thing I think to be said about Malcolm Turnbull, which perhaps reinforces what Catherine was saying, was we are looking at a man who was perhaps the most popular Prime Minister in our recent history when he first got the job. I mean, there was a national sigh of relief.
Yeah, well, there's an explanation for that, if I can give it.
Yes.
I think there is an explanation for it, because I don't think it's a lack of commitment to particular policies. But as Catherine indicated, he comes from a sort of a merchant banking type of thing, where you say, well, all right, if you don't agree, how can we get this done?
Yes, how can we get the deal done?
I hear people in the public saying, why can't you people work together? So you get Malcolm, who comes in and says, well, OK, why don't we do that? Why don't we, you can't always have your way. It's not a dictatorship being Prime Minister. It's not a dictatorship being in government. It's why we have a parliament.
Yeah, but where's the line between compromise and saying, oh, well, I'll give up on a republic and I'll give up on...
He hasn't given up on a republic. Why do you say that?
Well, he's not campaigning for one, as far as I could see.
But he's made it very clear he would like Australia to become a republic.
And what's he done about that?
Well, he says he's happy to wait until the death or abdication of the current monarch. And that might be the best chance Australia has of becoming a republic. I think if Malcolm pushed it earlier, and anyone pushes it earlier, and we lose again, because I was born a Republican, it will be delayed even further. I think the best shot is later. But look, let me get to the point. And the point is, we have a different parliament. Well, you all keep interrupting. We have a different parliament. We have a much more divisive Senate than was there 10, 15, 20 years ago. Much more.
Sure,
and that means more negotiating has to be done. The idea that a Prime Minister can just have his way is lunacy. And I'm just not listening to any of that about that Malcolm, because he hasn't had his way all the time, he's not any good. No Prime Minister gets their way all the time.
Off you go, Sean.
I think governing is absolutely more difficult than it used to be for many reasons, including a rampant media cycle. But as Prime Minister, if you can't pursue the Republic, for example, actively, and Amanda, I accept your arguments on that, then you have to have an agenda that takes on the nation's attention and which shapes perceptions of you and your government through the prism of what you want for the nation. And I think that can come from one of two sources. It can either come from yourself. You can be an ideas generator, like, say, Paul Keating, like, say, Kevin Rudd, perhaps, or you can be... Oh,
that was a success story.
Well, sure.
You shouldn't have gone there for your own side. No.
It's just, as Prime Minister, for a period of time, to generate momentum, you need ideas. They can come from you, or they can come from a cabinet which is generating ideas. Now, I think a very real problem for this government is that it actually doesn't have that strong a cabinet. It has a united cabinet for until quite recently, which has been actually quite impressive and a strength of this government. But I think one of the difficulties, Amanda, is that when you left, when a number of people of your cohort left, it was kind of, to be honest, the dregs of the Howard government left around, and they felt that they never should have been tossed out by Labor. There was simmering resentment there, and when they got back in, they thought, well, this is what we deserved, but they didn't have anything to replace it with. And so Malcolm Turnbull, as a technocrat, fine technocrat, hasn't been generating ideas of his own and hasn't had ideas thrown up to him from the cabinet either.
you look at what's been achieved over this time in government.
It's very little. It's very little,
Well, you
Amanda.
say very little. I mean, we can have an argument about that.
We can look at what Malcolm Turnbull has been saying. Look at what Malcolm Turnbull has said in the past 24 hours. Every achievement he points to is about more money. Some tax cuts here, more money in health, more money in education. They're fine. They're good things. But they don't amount to any perception.
To do good things.
But they don't amount to any vision for the country. They don't amount to an idea of what type of place
I think
you want
a better
Australia
health
to be.
system does. I think a better funded education system. I think those two things are critically important to the welfare of Australians.
Your loyalty is admirable, Amanda.
And I think the economy going well. You know what? You know the reason I'm a Liberal? Because I figured out pretty early on that if you wanted money to do good things, you needed the private sector to be going well. And Malcolm's trying to get, tax cuts through for companies, and you have Labor saying, Shorten, who used to say it was a good idea, now saying it's a bad idea. But, who knows whether the microphone's on or off and he's ever telling us what he really thinks.
Well, we do hear a lot about the moderates and the Conservatives in the coalition. Here's former Prime Minister Tony Abbott.
Where are this Prime Minister's convictions? What are his convictions? Now, we always thought he was convicted on climate change issues. I think he probably still is, and it was a conversion of convenience this morning.
Kath Murphy, what's your reflection on that, other than shaking your head and closing your eyes?
I'm sorry. I just need a moment to meditate before I open my mouth.
You wouldn't be alone.
Well, I'm sorry. But the idea of Tony Abbott talking about having any sort of conviction on climate change, this is a Prime Minister or a former Prime Minister who has had every position on climate change. Not just one position, he has had every position on climate change. And to talk about causes of convenience, how about a former Prime Minister who signed Australia up to the Paris deal? That was Tony Abbott, now railing against the Paris deal. I'm sorry, that is just intolerable. The degree of hypocrisy in that statement is just intolerable. I'm sorry, it needed a moment. I needed a moment before I could open my mouth because I may actually explode on television, which is not helpful.
I wouldn't explode, but Catherine, I think one point to make is that Mr Abbott sadly doesn't recognise how out of touch he is with the whole electorate and how fed up they are with him, with the kind of hypocrisy to which you refer. And I'm talking about normal people that I bump into, when I'm shopping in the Central Market or something. I'm not talking about political operatives, normal people saying, that guy had a go, why doesn't he go?
Hugh?
I think that's absolutely right. I think Amanda's right about that. And I don't think Catherine needs to meditate too much about this.
I do. I really do.
But those sort of comments, I'm just echoing what Amanda said, but those sort of comments are just irrelevant. I mean, it's just a kind of it's a continuous loop of white-anting of the Prime Minister from one point of view or another, depending on the day. But it hasn't got anything to do with the main game. And Amanda's right. If you talk to the voters at large, they're not regarding Tony Abbott as some kind of influential figure, except to the extent that he might have been a bit of a catalyst in the present performance.
Well, Hugh, I want you to give us though a dose of common sense here. Though we haven't had a recession in this country in a generation, and yet your last book talked about the anxiety and depression that is afoot in this country. Not to mention the political instability. Other countries seem to be able to wrap their heads around action on climate change without tearing down prime ministers and tearing their federal political life apart.
Yes.
What is wrong with Australia?
Well, some of the things that are wrong with Australia are wrong with Western societies in general. And you talk about our epidemics of anxiety and depression, and they are a major symptom of a social problem, which is the problem of increasing social fragmentation, the rise of individualism, and the fact that so many people now are suffering social isolation. In the UK, they've just appointed a Minister for Loneliness because of this problem. But this actually relates to a comment that Sean made a moment ago, because if you're talking about climate change or any other matter, health, education, etc., people are much more responsive if you're talking to them about your vision for the kind of society we would like to become and here's how we'll get there. And how we'll get there might be all the economics and other bits and pieces. But if you keep talking to us as though we are an economy rather than a society, well, generally speaking, people do tune out.
Okay.
This is a factor in our levels of anxiety and uncertainty and discomfort, but it's not the main factor.
For Sean, when you're thinking about the fragmentation of society, Hugh means it in one way, but are we also seeing Australia a fragmentation between, let's say, the types of people and voting patterns in Queensland and Western Australia as opposed to the southeast corner, New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT? How hard is it to govern this country where some people tonight will be saying, wow, Peter Dutton, isn't that terrific? And other people will be saying, who? That guy? Really?
Oh, it's absolutely, it's incredibly difficult. Even within Queensland, when people talk about Peter Dutton picking up Queensland seats, I know people who are much better on Queensland than I am who will say that is true in the north, but it is absolutely not true in the southeast. And that type of fragmentation is very, very difficult. And one of the reasons for that fragmentation, and there are many, but one of the reasons is media narrowcasting, that we all consume our own little narrow pocket of media these days, our own little narrow pocket of social media, algorithms feed ourselves back to us. We all know this. And I think one of the things that adds on to that is the fact that the media is so speedy and the media is so brutal. It's dominated by vitriolic opinions and attention to tiny little mistakes that increasingly we're seeing disillusion right across the country for different reasons take down Prime Ministers very, very quickly. Now, people in northern Queensland might dislike Malcolm Turnbull for different reasons from people in southeast Queensland, different from people in New South Wales. But they're all increasing their dissatisfaction with governments much more quickly than they used to be. And I think at the base here, Ellen, what we need to start seeing is greater courage from politicians on both sides, MPs who actually have the courage to stick with a Prime Minister from one election to the next, despite low opinion polls. Because once you get to an actual election, you're facing a choice between two candidates, not the type of hypothetical opinion polling that we see between elections when voters can register a protest knowing there's no consequence.
All right, we're coming towards the end of the program. Kath Murphy, Assistant Minister James McGrath, I'm being told, has also offered to resign in breaking news just now. How, we've all seen this movie before, does it end the same way? Does it end with Prime Minister Dutton? And if so, when? Or do you think we're heading for an election? What would you tell people tonight?
Well, it's fluid at the moment. It's fluid. I think history tells us that when we see a challenge to a leader, that they don't usually recover from that. I think all the hallmarks are there for that to be the case in this instance. I think this wholesale move away by the Conservatives, look, it would only take a senior figure like Matthias
It's not a move
Cormann.
away. It's a bigger vote than Malcolm had when he took over the leadership.
No, Amanda. I mean, no, I've paid your number, and I'll continue to pay your number. But we both know what's happening in the government, which is that the majority of the Conservative faction has picked up and walked away from the Prime Minister for the reasons that I identified at the first part of the show, and that is in play. Now, how the story ends, I'm not prepared to bet my house on it, but I don't think it looks good for the Prime Minister at the moment. I think the Dutton camp is in formation and is in drip, 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 drip mode to foment this sense of crisis and instability, which tends to work out badly for the incumbents of the Prime Ministerial office if the last 10 years are any reliable guide.
Amanda Vanstone, we've heard what you say on that. We've got literally 10, 15 seconds. What would you say to your colleagues in Canberra tonight, your former colleagues? Can Peter Dutton win them an election, yes or no?
I'd say he hasn't made his seat safe, so that should tell you something about his political capacity. And look at the same-sex marriage vote. He's not in touch with the rest of Australia. And marginal seat people need to be.
All right. That's all we have time for tonight. A very great thanks to our panel, Catherine Murphy, Amanda Vanstone, Sean Kelly and Hugh McKay. I'm back with you tomorrow night. We'll see what happens before then. Have an excellent evening. Good night.